Welcome to the MenTell Health Podcast. I'm Tim, and I invite you on my journey to talk about men's mental health. Before we begin, as always, a brief disclaimer. I am in no shape or form a mental health professional, but I've been to therapy, which obviously makes me an expert. No, I've been to therapy and I've worked on my mental health and have experienced the stigma around it, and I want to do as much as I can to help get rid of that stigma. And speaking of stigma, maybe you've been to a party or have had a social gathering or have just been to the pub and there's been someone who has said, I don't drink, or I don't want to drink any alcohol, or just didn't drink any alcohol. And I'm going to hazard a guess that in 8 out of 10 situations, someone commented on it. Someone said, oh, well, why? Why are you not drinking? That is weird. Why is it weird? I mean, there's people that, according to their religion, shouldn't drink alcohol, so they don't. There's people who don't enjoy the taste. There's people who don't want to have any of the possible health risks associated with alcohol. Some people just don't enjoy the feeling. And some people may have struggled with abuse and, maybe don't want to relapse it. And also at the same time, maybe don't want to have to, every time they go out and meet friends, have to deal with someone asking and having to explain what's been going on and having to go through that again. And yet we treat people that don't drink as the weird ones, and not the people that tell other people as weird that they don't drink. And that's not only with alcohol the case. It's with lots of other stuff that we do, that we enjoy, that have an addictive characteristic, where we decide that the person that doesn't do it is the odd one. Which, isn't that strange? But that's one of the stigma that people, and very much men, have to deal with when it comes to addictive behavior. And this is what I want to talk a bit more about in this episode. In previous episodes, from the top of my head, I could have looked it up, but because I don't prepare well enough, as you may notice every time you listen to or watch these episodes. But from the top of my head, I remember that I definitely spoke in episode 1, episode 3, and 7, and some others about how men are proportionately higher afflicted with alcohol, drug, gambling, and other abusive behavior and addictive behavior. Something that is sometimes not very much looked into or isn't well known is not only do men suffer more from addictive behavior, so they tend to be proportionately more addicted to alcohol, tobacco, gambling, sex, food, hard and soft drugs, whichever, according to the law, whichever is which. But also, when they do suffer from this addictive behavior, they have a higher social and economic fallout that comes from it. Of course, along with that goes that depending on the socioeconomic situation they found themselves in to begin with, because people in higher social structures, more wealthy people that struggle from addictive behavior, tend to not fall as far. There is, of course, the example that can be named now, where a person that was super well off has completely lost everything in their life due to addictive behavior. That is, of course, sad that happened, but proportionally speaking, there's more people that started not well off, had an addictive behavior, and then lost everything, which then could have led them to being homeless or even suicidal. Something that goes along with this is, of course, the access to help when you are coming from a more affluent background and can afford to go to certain clinics or can afford to get certain help, then you don't tend to fall as far. But also in certain social surroundings, it's not seen as that big of a problem to have an alcohol addiction or drug addiction, or it's more swept under the rug so that people can more function still, or also they have access to, when it comes to harder drugs, to better drugs because they can afford better quality drugs, so the fallout from any health risks aren't as severe. But I think one of the major issues is that the treatment options aren't as available for people of lower financial backgrounds and standing. And when someone looks at it, that 1 in 5 men will, in the course of their lifetime, develop alcohol addiction. 1 in 5. That is an insane high number. Sometimes the addictive behavior precedes a mental illness or can then lead to having mental illness if the addictive behavior not already counts as mental illness. But most often a mental health disorder, for example depression, can push towards some form of addictive behavior, alcohol, drug, or something else. And that's what's called a co-occurring disorder, when both of these happen at the same time. And people then find themselves in a devastating cycle where they cannot escape either. Their depression becomes severe, so they use the abusive or addictive behavior, alcohol, drugs, to try to get out of that depressive phase. But it doesn't work that way. They may numb it, but as soon as the drug stops working or once the high from the drug's gone, usually the depression is still there and then can lead towards using it again. Or if the depressive period happens to end once the high from the drug is gone and it feels like, I can do this, then the fear starts, but I don't want to experience that awful feeling of being depressed again. So to avoid that, I will already start taking any form of drug or addictive behavior just to avoid that from happening. And as I've talked about in previous episodes, a lot of men either aren't aware that what they're doing is something that goes along with a mental health disorder, or they don't want to acknowledge because they fear that they're being going to be stigmatized, marginalized, or made fun of, shown being vulnerable, when everywhere in society we tell them not to be vulnerable. And I know some people, I've read a comment the other day, sorry for this interruption, but someone said, everywhere in the whole world, in the whole media, men are mollycoddled and shouldn't, there's this whole idea that men are still supposed to be strong. It's just not happening. Well, is it though? Because just look at any ads or film or newspaper articles where that is not the case. Or go out and meet your friends and tell me how many of your friends are sharing their deepest and most vulnerable feelings with you, or are telling you that they have a big drug problem or that they're suffering from their depressive period. If that is mostly of your friends, then good on you. In your social circles, it seems to be going all right. But for most people, that's still not the case. And just look into the work environment and how people are being mistreated there. Or just ask someone from a minority group and how they deal with the interactions with men. And they'll probably tell you also that that's not really what's happening. So the lived experience of most people does not live up to what that commentator said. Unfortunately, I wish it was, but it's not. Anyways, and because of the stigma that men experience or are afraid of experiencing, they don't seek out help. Even though this co-occurring disorders, having a mental health disorder or suffering severely from mental health disorder and having strong abusive or addictive behavior is treatable, both of them at the same time can be treated, many men don't do it, or are afraid of seeking out help, or just don't know. There's still this massive lack of awareness of how much alcohol is too much, how these feelings that they experience, or these thoughts that they're having, are not normal, or are something that aren't normal and they're also not alone with, but are actually something that they can work on. Which is why I'm doing this podcast and hope to share it with as many people as possible to get awareness out there. And one of the big problems that people face when dealing with addictive behavior, or one of the big stigmata that they face, is that they're weak. If you are addicted to something, then you have a weak mindset, and if you just will yourself to stop doing it, then you will do it. And if you don't, then you're just not strong enough, or you just don't want it enough because it's so super easy. But there's still a debate where exactly addictive behavior comes from. But what most studies are pointing towards is that it's a combination of genetic predisposition and the environment you grow up in and you're living in. And yes, whilst I've said it before, and I will say it again, your genetic predisposition does not determine your outcome, because just because you have certain genetic predispositions doesn't mean that you will have to follow them. It's not a deterministic way that we're built. They just, if you have them, it's more likely, or it's going to be more difficult not to fall into these behaviors, but they don't determine what's happening to you. The social economic are more are a higher impact. So if we're telling people that they're weak, then they believe they're weak. And if the genetic disposition also makes it so much harder for them to stop the addictive behavior, whilst also being told that they're weak because they can't stop it, then how can they get help? Because they're on the one hand being told they can't get any help, because the help that they're being told to get, they can't do. It makes no sense. So all these gurus out there that tell people if you're just strong enough, willpower enough, you can do it on your own, they may not have the same genetic predispositions that other people have that struggle from these addictive behaviors and should just go fuck themselves. Sorry, trying to make money of vulnerable people is not really something that I like. I leave uncommented. And of course, towards dealing with addictive behavior, there is some willpower involved. You need to want to do it, but in order for that to happen, you also need to have the help and the support system necessary to realize that is something you can do. And if you don't have that, then the want doesn't necessarily follow, and it's a vicious cycle, and it's not easy. I'm not going to stand here and pretend that it's simple. It's hard work, and the most important thing to have is a support system, and to have people that you can talk to and rely on, not to do the work for you, but to encourage you to keep going. Because in the end, the only way to get, through an addiction is with hard work. It's not going to be easy, but it is easier with people around you that can help you. And that's why it's so important that men start being a community and starting to support each other. Because if you are in a relationship, your partner should be the only person you can rely on when you're going through this stuff. And if you are not in a relationship and have very few friends, then it's going to be way more difficult to deal with these kind of things. Another aspect that is highly associated with the development of a substance abuse is trauma. Experiencing trauma has a high indication of leading to a form of abusive behavior, addictive and abusive behavior, and that goes for everyone. But of course, if the trauma is not acknowledged as either trauma or is not dealt with, then it's going to be more difficult to recognize that is something that can happen to you and to avoid the falling into that. And there's lots of trauma that men suffer from that they don't acknowledge or don't get acknowledged. And they also cause other people and don't acknowledge. Men aren't just victims, they're also, in most cases, perpetrators towards other men and other groups. And we only stop that from happening by helping men stop being perpetrators. Just put that out there again. And these forms of traumata that men often aren't aware of can be divorced parents, sexual abuse in childhood or in adulthood, post-traumatic stress disorder from having experienced violence against them, or a lot of veterans coming back from war zones or from conflict zones, people that have lived in rough streets, have experienced violence against them or around them, have had to deal with financial struggles for a long time, have had to deal with parents suffering from a mental health disorder, abusive parents, abusive partners. All of that, a lot of men are meant to just brush over and not acknowledge. And that's something we need to do. We need to acknowledge the trauma that leads men to developing these addictive behavior traits. And there's also some addictive behavior that is not really talked about, but should be talked about because people suffer from them just as much. I've, in my life, had experience with people addicted to alcohol and abusing alcohol. My biological father was an alcoholic by the time I was born. For all the life I knew him, due to, I don't know if it was just due to his alcoholism, but I have no other resources because the siblings that I have with him decided not to talk to me ever again. It's a complicated story. If you want to know, just ask me. And I talk about it at some point. But for now, yes. He was an alcoholic in debt, and my few memories I have of him were one was very erratic behavior, another one was smelling of alcohol, and the third one was beating up my mother and me witnessing it. And so that is something that I've always in my life combined with alcohol, and I've been lucky that I didn't then myself develop a alcohol addiction, because it's very likely for someone that goes through something like this, of a parent that is an alcoholic. There's already the genetic predisposition, and then also the trauma makes it very likely to have alcohol and to then later in life also abuse alcohol. Fortunately for me, I've always associated alcohol with something that I should never do. And then when I started drinking, I was always aware of I don't want to become that, because my father also committed suicide when I was 4, and he was 50 years old. And if you listen to the previous episode 15, I lost track. I think it was 15. 50 is right smack dot in the center of the highest rates of suicide amongst men. So yay, my dad was average. Sorry, that was a macabre joke, but I've developed a very macabre sense of humor. And so I never wanted to also follow in these footsteps, so I was fortunate enough that my brain allowed me to stay away from alcohol. Additionally to that, my mother then had another partner later, when I was already an adult, who also was an alcoholic and also beat her up. So I've experienced this twice, which makes me even more aware of I don't want to become an alcoholic. I never drink by myself, or I think I can count the times I've drank when there was nobody else around on one hand in my life. Most of the time, or for the majority of my life, I've also stopped myself from becoming so drunk that I can't remember anything. It didn't always work. Sometimes either the situation didn't allow it because I didn't realize how much alcohol was in the drink, or I was just in a very bad mood or way, and then I did let it happen, but never in a way that I was like, oh, I need a drink. That's never happened. I can perfectly happily live without alcohol. However, like I said, there are genetic predispositions, and I've had my fair share of trauma in my life, so I am not free of addictive behavior. But the addictive behavior that I suffer from or have is something that's not most often talked about, especially not in men and not in these kind of conversations. Well, one of them was that I smoked for 10 years of my life. I started when I was 18, which was a weird thing to do, but I did. All my teenage years, when everybody around me was smoking, I didn't do it. And then when they started to quit, I was like, yeah, hell yeah. And now it's my time to shine. So that was one thing that I was addicted to. I managed to stop because of, well, if you want to know why I stopped and if you can handle it, listen to episode 4. I explained it in that one. I also took my fair share of drugs, especially into periods of my life where I was feeling very depressed, without knowing that I was depressed, because for most of my late teens and most of my 20s, I didn't know that was what I was going through, which is yet another reason why sharing this podcast is great for getting the word around for other people that don't know that what they're going through can be something that can be helped. And yes, something that I've been struggling with mostly is that I have a food addiction. Especially in times of very severe depressed phases, I cannot stop myself eating. I gouge myself on food. And it goes so far that, yeah, I know people might now think, well, yeah, who doesn't? And yeah, food is great, and you're a foodie or a bit chubby, who cares? No, it's worse than that. I hide that I eat. I feel embarrassed when I eat. I buy food so that nobody else sees that I have that, and then I hide it in places so that I can then eat it, or I get rid of the evidence that I ate too much. And sometimes it hasn't happened often, but it has happened where I ate so much that that my stomach couldn't handle it, and then I had to throw up afterwards. And I've always struggled with my weight, and when I'm in a good place in my mind, I manage to get the weight down. But as soon as the depression starts again, most of the time it goes out the window. Right now, fingers crossed, I'm in a good place where, even though I've had a long and very bad depressive phase, I've managed to keep the eating at bay, apart from one weekend where I made myself sick from eating too much. But it hasn't yo-yoed completely. But yeah, it's been bad, hiding the food in places so that the people I live with don't know. Even my partner, who I until recently hid that from. I've been more and more being more open about it and being like, yeah, I eat too much and I struggle from it. And she always says, I don't see you eating that much, but I mean, obviously your metabolism must be worse than mine. And I mean, it is, but it's also that the fact that I eat multiple bars of chocolate a day and then get rid of the wrappers before she even sees them. So of course she doesn't know that I'm eating more, or to her it appears that I eat less. And it has been something that I've done for a long time, where food is my comfort and food is the place I turn to. And the worst part is that when I'm really severely depressed, it doesn't work. And only very recently is that something that really happened in my brain, where I've realized it doesn't actually make me feel better. It's a plaster that doesn't do anything. But for the most part of my life, when it didn't work, I just kept on eating, kept on going, so that at some point, hopefully it would work and then I would feel better. Most of the time it didn't work. But funnily enough, well, probably not that funny, while as much as I've struggled with eating too much, there is a point, and I've reached that trigger point once, not twice, but once really severe, where I was so stressed that I didn't eat. And that was in that relationship that episode 9 is about, if you want to hear more about that, episode 9, but where I lost a shit ton of weight because it reversed. I wasn't depressed, I was anxious the entire time, I was completely on edge, I was stressed, I was, completely in panic the entire time, and then I didn't eat, and then I lost shit ton of weight, only to then, once that relationship ended, and be going back into old habits, being depressed again, gaining quite a lot of it. And whilst I have not struggled with alcohol or severe drug addiction, I had a long period of a few years where I smoked a lot of cigarettes with addition. Let me say it that way. But I don't think I was addicted. At least the behavior wasn't how my food behavior was, which is an addiction. And it's not something that is talked about a lot. It's not something that's encouraged a lot, because people that have food or weight struggles are told that they are just weak, or just eat less, just have some discipline for once in your life, or just move. And I move a lot. Well, I move more than I used to for a big part of my life. I still, compared to other people, I mean, I have an office job, so I don't, for long periods of time, I stand or sit. But I'm much fitter than I was in my 20s now. I cycle a lot, I do exercise, I can do push-ups. I could never do push-ups when I went to school or afterwards university, and I've trained myself a lot, but I still struggle with food. And still being told by people, well, the ones that I'm not close to, that, deal with it. And it's totally fucked my body image. I don't see when I lose weight, because it's always such a yo-yo that I've completely started to only see myself in the highest shape that I've ever been. So it always takes a lot of effort once I start to lose the weight again to notice it. And it's usually my clothes where I notice it first. I don't notice it visually most of the time. And it's also for a long period of time made me feel very unattractive in my body. Not because I think being overweight makes me unattractive, or people that are overweight are unattractive, but because I felt ashamed of the way I became overweight and of the way I dealt with food. And that's something that's also not very talked about. In any addiction, because obviously when we do addictive behavior, our bodies react to it. When you drink a lot, something happens to your body. When you take drugs, when you gamble, and other forms of addiction, stuff happens to you, and it's most of the time it's visible, and it also has long-term consequences, but it's mostly ignored or talked about behind the back, because obviously addiction is a difficult behavior. You don't want to assume, and you don't want to make people feel uncomfortable, because people that are being called out or pointed at or shamed or blamed tend to not really ask for help afterwards. But on the other hand, ignoring it usually also doesn't go that way. So it is a difficult subject, but it is not something that's impossible. Again, as always, the best way to deal with stuff like this is to talk to people. Not necessarily, hey, I think you have a problem, unless you are on that level with them, but in a way of, how are you? How's it going? What's going on with you? Is there anything that's a problem to you? Or hey, I'm dealing with this and it's really, really sucks. Thank you for talking to me. And, you can always talk to me, of course, by showing them, other people, that you are vulnerable, that allows them to be vulnerable as well. And that's what we should do with men as well. Show them that vulnerability is not something that is bad. Show them that being addicted to something is not something that defines their personality and that is bad, but that, it can be helped. It can be something that is treatable, or not can be, that it is something that is treatable. And that the person that doesn't drink at a party is not the weirdo, but it's just experiencing or having enjoying the time how they want to. And so as always, my final statement is, let's talk to each other, let's be open towards each other, let's open up about each other, and with each other. And then it's not easy. I mean, making this public has not made it's not easy. It's not something that just slips off the tongue, and it's like, nonchalantly I'm sharing this with everybody. But I do truly believe that that's the only way we can become a better and more welcoming society for everyone, by showing each other that we all are vulnerable, we all have shit we deal with, and we all struggle and work through our struggles, and are open and welcoming to help other people work through their struggles. So talk to people, and if you have no one to talk to me. I have an anonymous contact form on the website. I have a website, MenTell-Health.com. I have a Instagram account, MenTell Health _podcast. And you also the YouTube channel, MenTell Health Podcast. All of these are possibilities to reach out to me. Obviously, none of them mean you have to share something with the world. I'm obviously very happy for people to come on the podcast and share their stories with me and everybody else. But I'm also already happy if people just reach out to me and build a community that way. And if you would like to maybe have me start a Facebook page, let me know, so that there's like a closed circle where people can talk to each other about. Not talk to each other about, talk to each other about whatever they want. So this is it for this week. As always, I would be super grateful if you could rate and or share this podcast, give it a review on any of the podcasting apps, subscribe on YouTube, share it with your friends, family, and whoever you think could benefit from this. And remember, I see and I hear you, and I hope you're here and or see me again next week. Goodbye.